54 cents, 95 cents, 75 pence, 68 cents. All of these amounts represent some form of the gender pay gap. The fraction of what a woman earns for every dollar, euro, or pound a man earns. And the pay gap is what brings us here today on Equal Pay Day. Good morning, my name is Dawn Lyon and I head corporate affairs for Glassdoor. We could not be more proud to bring together this group for our roundtable on pay equality. Expect it to be a frank and hopefully very lively discussion. At Glassdoor, we believe where you work matters, and transparency around work helps people make more informed decisions about important areas of their lives. And transparency around pay is critically important because it illuminates those inequities and those gaps, and it helps people, employees, and employers figure out the steps to close them. We are currently live in New York. We've got about 400 in our audience here, and we have thousands tuning in on the live stream around the world. The good news is we can all do something to join in the conversation and work toward those solutions. The hashtag today is Share Your Pay. Imagine, just for a moment, if all of us, if everyone everywhere shared their pay. Suddenly all the secrecy, all the uncertainty evaporated. Imagine. Our roundtable panelists today are an esteemed group of individuals, of leaders and experts. They've all witnessed the pay gap. Many of them are living it, currently living it, and all of whom, most importantly, are doing something trying to stop it. So let's meet them. Our moderator today is Dianne Brady. She's an award-winning journalist, author, and commentator. Dianne spent more than 2 decades reporting and editing for Bloomberg Businessweek, The Wall Street Journal, and today runs her own consultancy. Seated around our table, Dan Hinkle. Dan is the president of the Gap Foundation and senior vice president of global sustainability at Gap Inc. He is also the chair of the board of social accountability, and his focus is ensuring that Gap is a leader in international labor standards. Tracy Sturdivant. Tracy is the co-founder and co-executive director of Make It Work campaign. She is dedicated to increasing the civic participation of women, people of color, and youth. She sits on the boards of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Greenpeace USA, and Higher Heights for America. Megan Rapinoe. Megan is a world champion soccer player and gold medalist in the World Cup and Olympics. She's also a powerful voice for equality and is one of 5 players in the U.S. women's soccer team who recently filed a wage discrimination suit against U.S. Soccer Federation. Lori McKenzie. Lori is executive director of Stanford University's Clayman Institute for Gender Research. She is also co-founder of the organization's latest initiative, the Center for the Advancement of Women Leadership, and the founder of the online Voice and Influence program, which aims to provide people with the skills, information, and inspiration to be as effective as possible. Our next panelist happens to be my boss, Robert Holman. He's co-founder and CEO of Glassdoor. An engineer by training, he has spent much of the last 2 decades focused on empowering consumers with data. First at Expedia, then Hotwire, and now Glassdoor. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Robert, who will introduce our final panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you all for being here this morning. I started Glassdoor 7 years ago because I believe that where you go to work is one of the most important decisions that you make in your life. And I think that everyone deserves to be at a job and a company that they can love. We know that being in a job that you love has a lot to do with being in a job that you feel treats you fairly and equally, and being paid fairly for equal work is a critical, important part of that. At the end of the day, equality at work isn't an employee right, it's a human right. I'm extremely honored to introduce our next panelist who has a long background of public service and social activism. Secretary Clinton has spent an entire career advocating for equality and women's rights. The topic of equal pay and the gender pay gap specifically is an issue which she speaks often and passionately about. She brings to our discussion today insights and ideas for how to address it. She also brings feedback to share from what she's hearing on the road from across the country in her day job. So please this morning help me in giving a warm welcome to the stage for Glassdoor's Roundtable on Pay Equality, Hillary Clinton.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hey, thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you very much, Robert. I am absolutely thrilled to be here on this occasion. I want to thank Robert and everyone at Glassdoor for hosting us today and lifting up this issue. It is Equal Pay Day. It is also the one-year anniversary of my journey in my campaign. So I am very happy to be with you. Now, we're here to talk about this pay gap that costs women and their families and our economy so much money every single year. And I emphasize the three aspects of this because what I have found as I've gone around the country now for many years, but particularly for this past year, is that it's important to make the point that the failure to ensure equal pay for women also impacts families and the broader economy. So Glassdoor is focusing on an issue that has really almost universal repercussions. Of course, it devalues the work that women do, from minimum wage workers to chief executives, and even the best athletes in the world. And Megan, who you will hear from in a minute, is the midfielder for the U.S. women's national soccer team. And we cheered when they won the World Cup, and we cheered when they won the Olympic gold medal. And we noticed that our men's team hasn't yet done that. Yet somehow, the men are making hundreds of thousands of dollars more than the women. Now, you know the phrase, equal pay for equal work. Well, in America, we believe in equal pay for equal play, too. And that's why we need to elevate this issue. But I will quickly add, we know not everyone is convinced. There's still a lot of misinformation out there. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to quickly debunk some of the myths about the pay gap. Myth number one. Some say there isn't really a gender pay gap. Well, that is just wrong. The typical woman working full-time in 2014 was paid 79% of what men were paid. But when you break it down, for African American women, that number is 60%. For Latinas, it's 55%. And the last time I checked, there's no discount for being a woman. Groceries don't cost us less, rent doesn't cost us less, so why should we be paid less? Now, myth number two. Some say this is a problem just for women, that men don't have to worry about it, but that's wrong again. If you're a man married to a woman, if you're a man who's the son of a working woman, if you're the father to a young working woman, this is your problem too. And plenty of men care about this issue because they believe in fairness and they know this just isn't right. Now, myth number 3. Some say, isn't gender pay discrimination already illegal? Why are we still talking about this? Well, because it still happens every day. And I have been talking to many tens of thousands of people for the last year. It is one of the most commonly raised questions in all of the events that I do. I met a young man in New Hampshire who got a job working as a cashier. He got the job in part because his mother was already a cashier at the same store. So when the vacancy came up, she talked to the manager, they interviewed her son, and he was hired. And he was, along with his mother, very excited. Then he brought home his first paycheck. They opened it together, ready to celebrate. He was only 17 years old. And they discovered that after 1 week on the job, he was making $1 an hour more than his mother, who had worked there for 4 years. I was also asked by a young girl in Las Vegas, if you're elected the girl president, will you be paid the same as the boy president? I said, well, I think so. That's why organizations like Glassdoor are important, because you promote transparency. That is really at the root of what we're going to be having to advocate for and secure. That's why we also need legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act, so people won't be fired or retaliated against for asking what their coworkers make. If you're scared of people having more information, that may raise a question you should ask yourself. Maybe you're not being fair. Now, there are a lot of other reasons why women end up earning less than men over the course of their lifetimes, and we've got to take all of those on. I'm very proud that New York and California have raised the minimum wage because nearly 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. 2/3 of workers in tipped jobs are women. And those jobs are hard, they're often insecure, and they don't pay nearly enough. I hope the rest of the country will catch up with New York and California. Women all over America deserve a raise. We also have to encourage more women to enter higher paying fields like science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, these were not that open to women, and in some cases just downright unwelcoming. Now more women are venturing in, contributing every day as innovators, inventors, coders, builders, and discoverers. And these are good jobs, and good jobs mean better pay. We also have to do more to support working parents, moms and dads alike, so they can stay on the job and keep more of their paycheck. We should be supporting paid family leave in our country, and again, I'm very proud of California and now New York and other states that are making significant strides in that. It also shouldn't cost as much for parents to afford quality child care so that they can focus on work when they're at work. And so I think we have to look at this issue of equal pay in the context of everything else we need to do to support people, particularly women who are in the workplace. Now, perhaps the biggest myth of all is we can't solve these problems. Well, I absolutely reject that. We can if we summon the political will. These are going to be some of the biggest issues that'll come to the forefront of our political and economic lives. Other countries have made it easier for women to be mothers and have careers, to be caretakers, especially of their parents, and have careers. Not out of altruism, but because they know it's foolish to let half the population's talent and energy go unused. If we want to compete and win in the global economy, which I certainly hope we will, we need to make it possible for everyone to contribute. So this Equal Pay Day, let's commit to doing our part to make America a more equitable place. Our parents and our teachers, let's encourage our girls. Our bosses, let's treat women fairly. Let's go the distance to support employees with family responsibilities. For Congress, let's pass the Paycheck Fairness Act and support paid family leave. Now, occasionally, when I give a speech like this, which I do practically every day, people will say, oh, there she goes, she's playing the gender card. And what I say to that is, if talking about equal pay and paid leave and more opportunities for women and girls is playing the gender card, then deal me in. Because these are... These are absolutely incredibly important questions in the lives of countless women in our country, in their families' lives, and in the future of our economy. So I'm looking forward to the discussion with these amazing panelists, and I thank you all for being here to join with us in lifting up the importance of the Equal Pay Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. I think we're honored to have such a passionate and long-standing advocate for closing the gap. And welcome, everyone. I think this is a fantastic way to set the scene for this morning's discussion. I want to turn to Robert because, as Secretary Clinton said, you promote transparency. You also collect a lot of data. So what does it show?
Yeah, so here is what the data says. Glassdoor is a jobs and careers site. People come, they give us their salaries anonymously. So we collect millions and millions of salaries from workers every year. We looked at about 500,000 for this study, and we saw almost the exact same gap. About 70 women earn on a broad average 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns. But that's a very broad average. That literally is just taking the average of what women make and the average of what men make. And because we have finer grained data, we're able to go even deeper than that and to understand the drivers behind that so that we can begin to actually do something about it and change it. So here's the deal. About half of that gap is what we call career sorting. Women end up in careers that pay less, or they end up across their career having less education than men, on average. I think that as we look back, while that's explainable, it's not justifiable. There are a lot of reasons for it which are just wrong, beginning with the subtle and not so subtle signals that women and girls are given to avoid technical fields, which have turned into very high-paying jobs over time. Now, we're able to correct then this data set, taking into account education, experience, location, what your job title is, what company you work at, how long you've been in the job. And so we can get very detailed. And what we see at the end is there is still, after you take all of that into account, a 5 to 6% gap, which is unexplainable, and which every way we slice it looks like unintentional, and in rare cases, I believe intentional bias. And that also needs to change.
Well, it's interesting about bias because when we think about the choices that we make, you've done a lot of work in bias. Laura, I'd love you to hear some of your thoughts on this to frame the debate.
You know, the pay gap hasn't really moved since 2001. Women in leadership haven't really moved since 2001. And we're looking at bias, and there are 3 ways we can kind of debunk what bias really is. One is that women are often held to a higher standard. So while we're looking at who's promotable, we'll say that she gets maybe a 99 and he gets 100, and we decide to promote the person who got 100. So bias means women are being evaluated for pay increases or promotions with a harsher standard. The second dynamic is access to the highest paying jobs. We know that networks tend to evolve around people who are like each other. So if women are excluded from those networks, they don't have access, again, to the highest paying jobs. And the last one is what Shelley Carell coined as the motherhood penalty. When we see even on a resume that a woman belongs to a parent-teacher association, we offer her less money, less likely to hire her, and view her as less competent. So when you break down bias to the way it actually plays out in the workplace, it has some really real dimensions that I think we can take action on immediately.
Well, yeah, so Tracy, I want to turn to you because we've talked about this a lot. I mean, give me some sense as to how this plays out for women of color, some of the issues we talk about with bias, and also the gender gap obviously is a much bigger problem.
Sure. I mean, Secretary Clinton just sort of laid out some of the numbers. As we said, the gender pay gap overall is roughly around 77 cents to every dollar that a man makes. But for women of color, those numbers are more challenging. 60 cents for African American women, 55 cents for Latinas. So let's think about that over the course of the lifetime of a woman of color. On average, our friends over at the National Women's Law Center say that over the course of a woman's lifetime, she would lose over $400,000 in pay. For African American women, that's $900,000. For Latina women, that's over $1 million. So if you're a mom, let's say your name is Jessica, you live here in...
I'm a mom, 3 kids, my name's, yes. I'm not in the PTA though, must be.
Well, let's say your name is Jessica, you're a Latina woman, you live here in New York City, you've got a 3-year-old daughter, you've got another kid on the way, and you work in retail. You spend half of your paycheck contributing to your household. You and your husband are excited about your new kid coming, but there's no paid family leave yet. It's not enacted here in the state, won't happen until 2018. But you got paid sick days, so if your kid gets sick, you can stay home from work. But you're now thinking about what money you need to be able to take that unpaid leave. And childcare costs anywhere from $11,000 a year. You know, that's on average, as much as in-state tuition in some states. So now you're thinking about what do we need to do to be able to make ends meet, pay for childcare and this leave. And frankly, if you're then going back to the fact that she's making 55 cents to every dollar that a man is making in the same job, she's losing about $25,000 a year that could go towards that childcare, that leave, any other household expenses. And frankly, it's just not right.
And is the government the answer? I'd like to turn to Secretary Clinton and then obviously Megan with the case that you've brought forward. What is the role of government in fixing this? Because we're talking both private sector and public sector. I know that you've been a strong advocate. What can policy do? What can't it do?
Well, there is already laws at the federal level and in many states that make the failure to provide equal pay illegal. But the problem is there's not enough transparency, to go to Robert's point, and we don't know exactly what the pay gaps are in many settings, predominantly in the private sector, because in the public sector, there is more transparency if you're being paid by taxpayer dollars. That's why I could tell that little girl, I think I'll get paid the same as the president, because that's on the record. Right. Or if you're working under a union contract, that also has a more transparent pay scale. So our challenge is to really demand transparency, and that's what I really like about the Glassdoor work, because it's tried to get into the details. First of all, it should absolutely be prohibited that you would be retaliated against or fired if you either deliberately or inadvertently learn information about your coworkers' salaries and benefits. That's how Lilly Ledbetter found out that she was a supervisor in a factory, the only woman, never knew she wasn't paid the same, overheard a conversation, got additional information. So no retaliation in any way. And then I think that the government has to do more through the passage of the Paycheck Fairness Act to really require companies to be more transparent in the first instance. There is now some willingness in Silicon Valley to do that. I give people like Mark Benioff at Salesforce a lot of credit. Gap has been a real leader in this. And so if CEOs and board members will actually ask themselves, how sure are we that we are paying people the same? Because the data shows that even in the best intentioned company, that is often not happening. A recent survey in Silicon Valley, and we use it because they're now focused on trying to unpack what's happening there, thank goodness. Even at high school level entry jobs, all the way to postgraduate jobs, women were not paid the same, even if they had the same years of experience, the same education. And I want to just add to a point about implicit bias. You know, once we do more transparency, once we do more encouragement, incentivizing, maybe both carrots and sticks, so that companies are more forthcoming, we still have to be willing to address these implicit biases. The research is absolutely conclusive that people, men and women, carry different ideas in our brains, our consciousness, about how to evaluate men's and women's work. So it's the same with racial and ethnic disparities. You can give somebody a resume with exactly the same information. One's a woman, one's a man. One's clearly, perhaps, Latino or African American by identifying characteristics. One isn't. And there is just an overwhelming body of evidence that people who hire gravitate toward those who are white men. If there is anything like a close contest, any amount of willingness to say, okay, maybe I'll take a chance is pretty hard to find. People feel they want to make a safe decision, and that's how they judge it. So we need to enforce the laws we already have. We need to get more transparency, the Paycheck Fairness Act. We need to use the federal government, Department of Labor, and others to really encourage more transparency, to get more public information. And then we have to be clear that there are implicit biases and really challenge all of us to ask ourselves, why are we making these decisions?
Now, did you want to add a point, Robert?
Yeah, you know,
That anticipation.
again, I have some data here that's kind of interesting. People don't actually really disagree with this. 9 of 10 people agree that women and men for equal work should be paid the same. In fact, 60% of people said they actually will not apply to a company if they knew that that company didn't pay their workers fairly. And so my argument to employers is, this is, from a self-interest standpoint, in the war for talent, which in many industries is just a constant battle to get the best and smartest people, you are cutting off your access and your ability to do that, particularly over the long term, if you're not addressing this problem head on.
Now, can I go to Megan and then, but go ahead, Trace, do you want to add a quick point?
Yeah, just one other point on this. There is a role for employers to play, but there's also a role for individuals to play. You know, as kids, we're taught it's not polite to talk about money. So there's a cultural shift that also needs to happen around people feeling comfortable, even with the laws that provide people with the space of not being retaliated against, to say that it's okay to have that conversation and begin to talk.
Or if you love what you do,
That's
you know,
right.
that should be good enough, which gets to you love what you do, Megan, and yet here you are with U.S. Soccer, your teammates filing a complaint, you know, with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. What prompted that? Because that was transparency around revenues as well, wasn't it? How much money you make relative to what the team makes.
Right, we should just be happy we're there, right? That's right. I think for us, for a long time, to the point of transparency, we've known the contracts of the men's for a long time, and we've really grappled with, because we've always gotten in return, well, you don't make any money, and the revenues are way different. The men make more money, and men's soccer is bigger, and FIFA gives more money to the men. And I think this year, after winning the World Cup, the Victory Tour, all of these games, the incredible success we've had, we were still grappling with that a bit. We didn't have the numbers. We felt it. We can go to a stadium and see there's 50,000 people, 10 games in a row, but we didn't have the numbers. And so I think it was late February, early March, actually just before one of our meetings with the Federation, they actually released all these numbers. I'm not sure they were fully aware of the unintended consequences.
That's right.
We were singing our praises.
And what did the numbers show?
Yeah,
Remind
the numbers
us.
showed that we had in the black of like $17 million that they hadn't even budgeted for. So that to me says, first of all, they didn't budget for it, which means they didn't market for it. They didn't do extra branding around it or anything really extra to grow this business that they have, this exploding business of women's soccer. There will undoubtedly be certain years that the men's team makes more than us, and there'll be years that we make far more than them. And I think for us, it's a matter of building on those years. And you have this product, and I understand it was a World Cup year, but you have this product that made so much money, and they didn't even think to market it in that way. There's so much growth that can happen. So I think for us, we really benefited from that transparency, and that was a tipping point for us, where we just felt like we have everything now. We have the feeling, we have all the facts, and really the popular support amongst the country.
And I think that's what's, because Tracy referred to this a bit too, is how difficult it is, even if you have the facts, to actually step forward and say something. And so I want to pivot to Gap, but I want to ask you first, how tough was it to make the decision to actually go against U.S. soccer? I mean, you've made many decisions around trying to negotiate for pay, to actually sort of take this public move. Were you hesitant?
I think when it finally came down to it, we weren't. We're sort of far enough into this fight that we've tried to go about it in the nicest way possible. And it's kind of that argument of being twice as good
Right.
all the time. You just want to be good enough just the way you are, and we're very good the way we are. So I think once it came, we were like, yeah, this is, yeah, we were ready. We were ready for it, and I think that we, as a team, have a very sort of keen understanding of our platform in the country right now and around this issue of women's equality, and we love shouldering that load.
Dan, why did Gap look into this? Did you suspect that you had challenges in this area, or what prompted it? Because you have a very strong record.
Interestingly, we had our 45th anniversary in 2014, and we were talking about our founders, Doris and Don Fisher, and it's kind of an interesting story. They co-founded the company, put equal investment into the first store, and we were just talking about this culture of equality that they started. And we were really thinking about what are some ways that we could honor Doris. Don has since passed, but we wanted to honor Doris, and we said, let's take a look at this issue. We felt that the results would be actually good, but we had not done the analysis. So we looked at pay equality, and we found that we actually had equal pay for equal work. In fact, it ended up being 100.0%. There was actually no variation. And it was almost, quite frankly, when I went through this, I thought, is it too good to be true? So we actually had our numbers validated, and I think Lori from the Claimant Institute, they referred us to an external firm that looked at our methodology.
So what's the secret? What's the secret to getting that 100.0? Because there's so many different ways you evaluate people. You recognize excellence in a form that resembles yourself. Everything we've talked about.
Sure.
What is it that you've done differently?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about is that from the very beginning, we've had senior women around the leadership table. So you think about that, co-founders. Today, 4 out of 5 of our brands are led by women. 75% of our senior leadership team is female. We think that helps. But it's not just a representation of women in leadership, it's also every single decision. So one of the things we say is you don't get to pay equality by accident. You really have to be thinking about your hiring, your promotions, annual pay decisions, how you're evaluating performance. All of that has to be considered. You're not going to just get to pay equality. You actually have to think about it every step of the way.
And so much of this is subjective. You're nodding. Lori, give me some sense. What advice do you have for employers? What can we learn from Gap's experience and others as to how you actually close the gap?
I love what you said, because often we think it's only policy or it's only women negotiating.
Right.
And actually managers have a great deal of discretion over. So even if we look at the pay gap in terms of base salary, managers determine what bonus you get. And researchers show that even when salaries are equal, bonuses can be unequal, because it's who do I think deserves a bigger bonus this time?
The performance review, which you don't.
Right, exactly. Who does the performance review, and are men getting a slightly higher score for the exact same work? So then we match raises to that slightly higher score. That's how part of the pay gap evolves. And lastly, who gets stretch assignments? So assignments that put you up for the higher paying jobs is determined by your managers. So I think one of the most important things we can do is think about pay gap and leadership in the same bucket. Whatever's holding women back from rising to the highest paying jobs, a lot of it is bias, is also the same dynamic that's keeping the pay gap in place. And how can we empower managers to want to do better? I was talking to one engineering manager, and I laid out the data for him, and he saw that this issue wasn't just about his performance evaluation, it was how he gave feedback every day. And he said, I didn't realize I'm talking to the women engineers about teamwork, and the men engineers about being technical leaders. And so over time, they have very different career paths that pay differently. And he saw that he could change that. Talk to the men about being great team leaders and technical competence, talk to the women about being great team leaders and technical competence, and in his coaching every day, leveling the pay gap and access to leadership.
You know, Tracy, I want to get to you because so much of it comes down to how the choices we make, and do we negotiate enough, and are we in the right jobs? What do you think about this in the context of the people you're talking to? Is it because it's partly a personal problem, partly policy? What advice do you have, and what thoughts do you have in terms of how people should be paid in all roles?
Sure. It's always an interesting question when you talk about women and choices. I'm sure for Megan, it wasn't about a choice, being paid less than the men on the
He's really good at baseball, too, right?
That's enough.
Right. Or, for Lily Ledbetter, who was, for 20 years paid less than the men doing the same job at Goodyear Tire. Or for myself, working in an industry and knowing that I was being paid significantly less than a man who was doing a very similar job than myself. It's not about women's choices, it's about, to Lori's point, employers' choices. And we really need to have a conversation about what that means. Can we talk about, how the role of women and our role as caregivers influence, that? Absolutely. But also looking at how the lack of paid family leave, affordable childcare, increasing the minimum wage, does that influence it? Absolutely. So there are a host of issues that I think as we go around the country and talk to real people that it's, a perfect storm of instability, and you can't talk about one single issue because people just don't lead single issue lives.
So Secretary Clinton, you've been working on these issues for a long time. Have you feel the tone of debates changing? Do you feel that we're at a pivot point right now where we're going to make some real traction on this in terms of the pay gap?
Well, I hope so. And I think there is a conversation developing that takes into account all of these different perspectives. And probably what has helped the most is data. Data that can not only be collected, but analyzed from many different perspectives. I think the recognition that people who you see in the public eye, like world champion soccer players, are not being treated fairly. I think that to some extent, we are starting a conversation which very much goes to, okay, if it's fair to talk about women's choices, then we also need to talk about employers' choices and how the money is distributed in order to support choices that are made in the workplace, right?
That's right.
So I think we are broadening the conversation, and we have so much more data. Lori's work at Stanford is incredibly fruitful in terms of furthering that conversation. Sheryl Sandberg's work. So there are a lot of well-known voices that are now saying, hey, wait a minute, we've been talking about this for a really long time. We've made some progress, but not anywhere near what we think we should have, given the urgency of this, because, a lot of people are feeling economically stressed. So this is not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity, and it's not about somebody else. It's about you, your family, and what you can expect to be able to afford for your future. So I'm actually optimistic, but I'm also very focused on making sure that we don't lose the impetus behind this conversation, that we get more companies like Gap or Salesforce or others to be public. Because Salesforce found something different. When they did their analysis, they found disparities. And literally, the very top leadership was shocked, couldn't believe it. So the more we get not just the CEOs, but the managers at every level. And the final thing I would say about this is, I think we have to get the best language about how to talk about how we continue to move forward in this arena, because there are so many people who don't yet accept that it is a problem that needs to be addressed, or that if it is a problem, there are so many other explanations for it. As you said, explainable, but not justifiable, a great line. And so we have to keep the conversation going. And I am optimistic, but only because we're doing events like this and studies like this.
So, Robert, I want to ask, because Glassdoor is one of the things that's unique about Glassdoor is we do think this is top down, and employers can't really control something like Glassdoor. People go on anonymously, they report a lot, but you also have companies go on. You've got a lot of data there now, and you've got insight into what a lot of companies are doing. We've heard about Salesforce, Gap. Can you give us some sense more broadly as to how employers are seeing this as a brand issue, and even how they're using sites like Glassdoor and others to really sort of try and highlight essentially this as a selling point for a company for talent?
Yeah. So there are tens of thousands of employers that are engaged with Glassdoor. You're right. It's a platform that allows people without the permission of really anyone to share information to help other people at the end of the day. But employers have embraced that, frankly, over the last decade. 2,000 employers have come to Glassdoor and taken the Equal Pay Pledge. And what that means is they've come and they've said that they're committed to looking at their pay and paying equal pay for equal work, which I think is fantastic. As I said before, I don't meet CEOs or managers who frequently, I actually never met one, but I'm sure they exist, who don't believe in this. What I think happens is they hear the 77% number and it just doesn't resonate. They say that it does. They don't. They say that's got to be explained by these other things, and then it kind of disappears from their mind. And they're partly right, because it is explained by these other things, even if not justifiable. It's explained by it. It takes courage to then, though, look at your numbers and go, there's probably some that isn't explained. And that's what Gap did, that's what Salesforce done, that's what a bunch of companies have done. And it is hard, because you have to look at the same people in similar jobs, et cetera. But it's rewarding, because at the end of the day, we know 6 in 10 people don't want to work at a company if they find out that they're not paying fairly.
So I want to talk about even best in class companies like Gap. You've noticed incidents where you can see how it plays out differently. So for example, the performance review, and why have you decided to sort of change your policies around that? Were you finding that becomes a fork in the road where some get paid more, some get paid less?
One of the things that we do, so we, 2 years ago, we announced that we've eliminated the annual performance review. We've replaced it with actually more frequent ongoing discussions. So we have ongoing discussions about performance, ongoing discussion about career development, stretch assignments, those types of things. We find that if you think about the annual performance review, oftentimes by the time you get to that discussion, all the goals that you're talking about are usually pretty outdated. Have a monthly conversation, and you're going to have a much, much better conversation. And the other thing that I think is really important to point out, that I really believe that you achieve pay equality when you are laser focused on performance. That's how you achieve pay equality. If you take all the other extraneous noise out of the system and you're focused on results and performance, you'll get to an equal result.
One of the things, Lori, yes, that deserves a clap.
I agree with that.
We took questions, from the audience as people were signing, and one of the things that comes up a lot is negotiating. And women don't negotiate enough, we don't come back often enough, we don't ask for enough. What have you found? And can you give us some sense even as to advice on that front?
It's a great question, because there is the dynamic that in general women will negotiate less than men. And I think it's because women are smart. Women realize that if they negotiate, they will be penalized for it. They might get a raise, but then they're not liked as much, and then not given a promotion because we don't think she has executive presence. She's fighting too hard for small.
Suddenly sitting up straighter. Yes, okay.
But here's the thing about transparency. If I knew that this was the landscape of work and how I fit into it, and I was told by my manager or by my company, we believe in fair pay. So any discrepancy you see, I welcome you to come to me and talk about it. In that environment, women will go to their managers and talk about pay in equal numbers and as effectively as men. And the other thing we always tell women, in the meantime, the more you can phrase your negotiation collaboratively, that you're doing it
Like
for
what
the
Megan
good.
did, basically, right?
Yeah, she's doing it on behalf of women everywhere.
Yeah.
The more that penalty seems to diminish. So in the meantime, until we have that really great focus on having managers open the door to open discussions, I think the more women can frame it in the good of their job or themselves or their families or their teams, the better.
Didn't you have a manager who actually was surprised that a woman didn't negotiate and raised her pay anyway?
Yeah, we had an interesting scenario where I think we had a male leader who went into a salary negotiation and said, you know, I'm wanting to land here. So the typical negotiation is you start a little bit lower and then you negotiate. And so he came back to me and he said, she didn't negotiate, and now I'm paying her less than I want to pay her. He said, can I just pay her $5,000 more? And I said, yes. And I actually thought that was a really good, but again, in his mindset, he was going into this like, well, there's going to be a negotiation, and there wasn't. So I think good for him to actually come back and say, no, I'm not going to
Can
actually
we
stand for this.
legislate that? No, we can't. Tracy, what do you think about negotiating? Because it has come up again and again, and I want to talk about it. Sometimes people don't always have the power to negotiate.
Well, not only do we not have the power, but oftentimes we're not taught. You know, when I started in the workplace, I didn't have it. My parents didn't sit me down and say, by the way, and go for that first job, here's how you negotiate your salary. And so, this employee was lucky enough to have a colleague who said, I want to do the right thing. And yes, we do have to legislate it because at the end of the day, most folks are not that lucky. So negotiation is a part of it, but again, it goes back to that cultural shift of needing, to be taught how to talk about money, and then having the data to know what I'm going in and talking about. The other thing that I think around the cultural shift that is actually happening, that employers are gonna have to get with, or they're gonna lose good employees, is that we have a culture now of sharing. I share my food pictures and my vacation photos, sometimes overshare.
Your paycheck.
Not just yet, but
Right now, I saw you tapping.
right? But there's a culture of sharing that social media and that millennials are driving. And so that culture shift is beginning to happen whether we like it or not, and that is the future of work. And so Glassdoor is on the cutting edge of providing a platform for that, but this is the wave of the future.
And
And quite frankly,
Go ahead.
sorry to
Go
interrupt,
ahead.
it's just the right thing to do. I mean, we
Yeah.
talk about the research is there, the public perception is there, there's nitpicking about negotiations, this and that, but when is it just okay that it's the right thing to do? I think that that's part of the argument as well. It's not okay.
Well, it's interesting that you rooted your argument in the fact that you're making more money than the men's team, even if you weren't. Do you think it would be okay? I always think that with women on boards, like, why do we have to be better? Isn't it just good enough that we're not worse, if you put women on boards? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel like it's tied to the revenue, or do you feel like just it's emblematic of broader issues around soccer? Can you share some of that in terms of just the investment in the sport?
Sure, I think there is a little bit that's tied to the revenue, but like the investment you say, I mean, there's a common thread in women's sports about needing female head coaches, and then the argument always goes back to, well, there's no female coaches that are good enough. Well, we haven't started investing in them young. Same with the program we have now. If you just expect to show up with this new product and make a ton of money, that's not really how business works. Startup need VCs, they need money to get themselves off the ground. And I think for us, we've already proven that we have been making money, and we already have proven that in this marketplace, we can stand alone even without the investment that we need. So imagine with the investment. And I think, for a company like US Soccer, the potential is huge, the upside. For them to just kind of switch their perspective and think of a paradigm shift in the way that they think of, okay, well, how can we now make even more money for sponsorships and TV rights and do it both on the men's and the women's side? And I think for us, it's less about, it's not like the men should be paid less, maybe they should be paid more as well, but to switch that and realize how can we capture this momentum that we have right now, and it takes grassroots investment.
Mm-hmm. So, Secretary Clinton, when you're out there on the campaign trail listening to these stories, I love the story about the son and the mother and the disconnect there. There is a sense of how do people feel empowered around this? What do you tell them? What advice do you give them on an individual level?
It is usually enough to recognize that they see it as a problem because they want that affirmation. They're not crazy. They're actually experiencing something that is unfair and is rooted in a whole bunch of other actions and factors going on that they're trying to sort out. And I think what we have to do now, and when I talk with people out on, the trail all over the country, they need to hear more of this whole conversation, because a lot of them just don't know what they're doing wrong. Why aren't I being treated fairly? I just learned that, fill in the blank, somebody that I came into the company with, somebody that I know I work harder than he does. Why am I not being treated fairly? Now, for a lot of young women, this is a revelation. And it is something that they feel is so wrong and goes back to the sharing economy and transparency. And so it's more of a question like, explain this to me. How can this be? And for women who have been in the workplace or been struggling with this, it's like, when are we going to get over it? How soon do we
And the gap increases as you get older.
Yeah, and the gap increases. So you have actually more pay parity, as I understand it, in today's world when you start to work, which is why I think a lot of younger women don't see this as a problem, because they're getting what they believe to be, and some even know to be, because of sharing, equal pay. But then as you go up in years, all of a sudden you find out it's not true anymore. Why? What happened? I'm still the same person. I work just as hard. And so there's a lot of insecurity, and part of what I hope we can do is create more of a sense of solidarity, if you will, so that women don't believe it's only about them. I've had young and middle-aged women say to me, I can't work any harder, and I know I'm working harder, and I get good response on the work I do, and then it comes time, and somebody else, usually a man, somebody else, gets the pay increase or gets the bonus. And so the more we can talk about this and not act like, there must be something wrong with you, there must be something wrong with women's soccer, there must be something wrong with how you did the job. At some point, let's be as clear as we can about what's actually going on, unpack it, and then help more people have the vocabulary to ask for that raise they're entitled to do it in a way that doesn't produce a negative response. I have lived through all of this, so I feel like it's something that is long overdue, but I know we've just got to keep moving forward and use every tool at our disposal to make the same point.
So we are unfortunately nearing the end of our conversation. And Lori, I actually want to go to you for some final words, because among other things, you've done research on the power in the middle, not just the C-suite, not just the individual, but those micro gestures, micro sponsorship.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some final thoughts, and then I'll go around the table and give us some takeaways for today.
I think the final thought is, don't wait for policy, don't wait for CEO commitment, take action now. Everyone has a colleague. And many of us manage people. And we can ask a few simple questions. Is the feedback I'm giving you the same feedback I give everyone? When I do my evaluations, am I thinking first, what does good work look like, and then writing my evaluation, or am I just remembering what I remember? And lastly, when I think about where someone will go, not just where they are, am I fairly thinking about everyone as a potential, or only some as a potential? So I think the key takeaway for me is take action now.
Great. Dan, quick thoughts?
Sure. Two things. One would be the power of data, and it's not just about pay, but there are lots of things you can do inside of a company. Look at promotion speed, engagement levels. There's so many different things that can feed into the final result. And the second thing is the power of transparency. And I would love to see every company out there talking about this issue. And even if they're not at 100%, get out there and actually say, look, we know this is an issue and here's what we're doing
Right.
about it.
Tracy?
You know, at the end of the day, transparency is key. Knowledge is power. And our campaign at Make It Work, we've been focusing on making sure that we're providing people with the space to have a conversation, both around how these issues impact their lives and how their voices and their votes make a difference. And so really understanding where elected officials and candidates stand on these issues and making your voice heard at the ballot box is going to be critically important.
Megan.
I think to the point that you had of taking action now, it's never going to be the perfect time, or you're never going to have every single fact that you need, but just taking action now, using your voice, standing up, and just not accepting something you know in your heart and you know in your gut to be unequal, and standing for that.
Great. Secretary Clinton, any final thoughts for us?
Well, I just want to thank everybody on this panel, and particularly Glassdoor, for elevating this issue in a way that really leads to answers, not just to concerns, because the concerns are real. And I want to say the final word about some of the other pieces of what I think we have to pursue in an equality, a work-life equality agenda. You know, raising the minimum wage, 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. I mentioned the tipped wage. Not everybody knows what that is, but in most places in America, you can be paid far less than the minimum wage. If you're a waitress, a bartender, work in a hair salon, you can be paid as little as $2.13 an hour, because the theory is you're going to make it up to the minimum wage in tips and maybe even go beyond. And the fact is that puts so many women in a powerless position. They can't stand up for themselves. They can't speak out because they are dependent upon the goodwill of their customers and their managers. And then paid family leave and affordable quality childcare. If we're really going to move the agenda further to workplace equality, recognizing that most people work to live, not live to work, then we need to recognize how we support each other as human beings in all of our various roles. And that's where I hope this discussion will eventually lead.
Thank you. Last words for Robert.
Well, let me end with thanking all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and especially you, Secretary Clinton. Your schedule's bananas. Thank you. Thank you for taking time to be here with us today. The world's not going to get less transparent. This is a trend that is one way. And it's only going to get more and more transparent. Companies that get in front of this, that embrace it, and begin to look at this data, it is challenging, but it's a totally solvable problem, and begin to take action, will have a disproportionate advantage when it comes to hiring in the future. So no matter who you are or what your job is, I am Glassdoor. We are passionate about you finding a job and company you love, you getting paid equally for it. We will continue to fight for that. Our hope is that Glassdoor brings life to your voice and the billions of people and workers around the world. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I know, and even when we talk to them now, it costs so much this, and it costs so much that. I mean, it's just
It's a great audience.
It really is, yeah.
Thank you.
Being in these negotiations, just listening to the way, almost these, for them, non-starters. Non-starters.
Here on those on the live stream and those in New York, we really thank you for your time and ask that you don't let the conversation stop here. Share your pay. Thank you.